Hello, everyone. This is the continuation of our presentation on the concept of security. In the first part, we talked about mostly the Cold War era and the realist approach to the study of security. So, in this approach, security was mostly state based. So, it was the security of a state and how states acted in order to uh, protect their security and defend their interests against any sort of security threats was the major issue. So it was state based, and in addition to that, we were mostly talking about high politics issues, meaning military and defense related issues, and these mostly uh, were included in the study of security. So it was mostly a limited approach to security, mostly military security, state based security. That was the focus of these studies. And we also said that the realists questioned the widening of the concept of security. We talked about, for example, a reference to Walt. He said that security studies may be defined as the study of the threat, use, and control of military force. So, what was talked about mostly was related to the military aspects of security. And widening the definition of security was mostly perceived as a quite maybe an ambiguous search for a new paradigm, for a new security paradigm. And it was thought that widening security or the definition of security would make the concept redundant because it would be too all encompassing and it would dilute the task of analyzing military threats and interstate conflict. So it would basically expand the concept of security, which would in effect make the operationalization of the concept and the study of the concept very difficult because of the dilution of the concept, because it becomes such a wide concept. Then we talked about, especially in the starting with the 1970s, a change in our approach to security. In the 1980s, also we see different authors, different theoreticians approaching security in a much different perspective. So we talked about three references. Ullman, writing in 1983, he talked about demographic pressures and resource depletion as new threats to security. Then Matthews, writing in 1989, talked about environmental problems such as ozone depletion and global warming as threats to security. And Ayub, writing in 1997, talked about internal rather than external threats as principal security concern, especially for the least developed countries. So we were seeing the attention of academia turning to other sources of threat than just military threat or interstate conflict or war as major security threats. So demographic pressures can be a threat of security, especially when, for example, we are faced with an expanding population in the world. The world's population getting 6 billion and even more than 6 billion. So this, of course, necessitates resources, both food, energy resources, consumption increasing, and this creates a pressure on the resources that the world has, which are, of course, finite. They are not infinite resources. So this creates a security threat because there will be more competition among states. People may also find it more and more difficult that their basic needs cannot be met. So all these can create existential threats for humanity. So it's not only states we are talking about now, it's also individual human beings and societies under these new security threats. Environmental problems, ozone depletion, and global warming, especially if you listen to people today, Fridays for Future, or let's say those people who are most concerned about global warming, climate change, they see it as the number one security threat for humanity because it's a matter of life or death. It's a matter of whether or not we will have humanity in 50 years' time, in 70 years' time. So it is an existential threat. So it is number one priority in our list of threats to security. Then also, not only wars or conflicts between states, but internal conflicts, ethnic violence, intrastate violence, ethnic strife, civil wars. These may be also more important maybe in our age than interstate conflicts, as we have seen in the case of Syria, for example, where we have a war continuing since 2011. The war is mostly in Syria, but other actors are involved. Russia is there, Iran is there, China is supporting maybe Iran there, Turkey is involved. We also have some operations by NATO countries, by European countries also in Syria, and the continuation of the Syrian conflict cannot be just seen as an inner conflict, because people are forced to flee their homes. They are displaced people. They are refugees seeking refuge in neighboring countries such as Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and some of them have made a transit to the European Union since 2015. So it has become a conflict which has created a lot of problems, both for the people of Syria, both for Syrians, but also it has become an international problem, an international issue. So internal problems are also major security threats. So of course, these did not happen all at once. We have seen such problems throughout history, of course. I mean, they are not new, of course. They are seen throughout history. But what is changing, maybe, since especially the 1980s and especially after the ending of the Cold War, is how we approach it, how we approach the realm of security studies. We also have other authors, for example, Peterson and Sebenius, writing in 1992, talks about crisis in education and growing economic underclass as security threats, especially in the United States. And Lynn Jones and Miller, writing in 1995, talks about virulent nationalism and social impact of migration as security threats. So these are again very serious issues that we are experiencing also today, and these can be seen as security threats. I mean, maybe if you would ask Kenneth Waltz, for example, or Hans Morgenthau, whether a crisis in education can be a security threat, maybe they would say, okay, it may be a problem, but it's a political problem, it's a social problem, and we cannot really study this in the realm of security studies. So they wouldn't really view this as a conventional, traditional security threat. However, in today's world, and especially in the recent era, the study of security studies has widened and expanded to also include such issues under the realm of security threats. So when we have a crisis in education, this means that we have problems in educating our young people. We may also see a case where, due to privatization, some youngsters can get a better education, while people who are dependent on public education system cannot really have let's say, the luxury of getting enough education or quality education. This may have multiple consequences, which creates security threats for the society and for the individual. First of all, these people cannot maybe get jobs, and they will have difficulty in having a decent standard of living. So they will maybe forced to seek employment in precarious jobs. They will not have a really viable income. So this will create problems in the life standards of the individual. Secondly, these people, because of the crisis in education, they may also have problems in, let's say, understanding the importance of science. They may turn to sects, for example, different religious sects, which will exploit these people, which again may be a social threat. Or in voting for the system, for example, they may vote for candidates that are, let's say, manipulating the problems, the grievances of these people. So it may also create a political crisis. And also, we can say that as here the writers have linked the crisis in education to a growing underclass. This is also a security threat because it will create inner conflict in the society. It will also create polarization and fuel the already existing fragmentation, the already existing, let's say, conflicts, the class-based conflict in the society. So this is a multiple problem which may create security threats in the society, in the political system, and also in human security. And then increasing nationalism and social impact of migration, again creating also sources of security threats. Here again, we may look at today's, especially some of the EU countries, where we have increasing nationalism. Nationalism is also again manipulated by politicians in order to gain their votes, in order to gain popularity and stay in office. One important case was, of course, in Hungary. We see now that the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban actually used the current coronavirus crisis as a pretext to extend his power. So he has basically suspended the parliament. He has gained indefinite powers to rule by decree in the country. He has also declared quite harsh sentences against people who are expressing their opinion, and since he links such expressions of opinion to disinformation campaigns, etc. So we can see that a leader who actually uses nationalism, populism, can be a security threat, especially for democratic society. And also the social impact of migration, again, something which we are witnessing today. And we see the rise of extra right-wing parties such as the Alternative for Deutschland Party or Front National in France, the first one, AfD in Germany, and these are again using nativist campaigns, populist campaigns, in order to scapegoat migrants, migration, and this also can create social crisis and political crisis. So all these are issues which can be discussed, and later on during the next weeks, maybe we will have a chance to look at what we mean by environmental security, what we mean by societal security, human security. We will dwell more on these issues. Another very important approach to security, especially which has emerged in the 1990s, is the Copenhagen School. The Copenhagen School was developed by writers and international relations experts such as Berry Buzan, Ole Wever, and Jaap de Wilde. Again, these writers established a very important approach to the study of security, and especially when you hear the concept of securitization, then we should understand that it comes from the Copenhagen School approach to international relations and security. And here, what the writers primarily meant was that we may have security threats in both military and non-military areas. So it may be human security, societal security, political systems security, military security that we are talking about. However, in order to make a distinction between security issues and other issues, we have certain criteria that we can use to distinguish them. And here they see that some issues are actually constructed as existential threats to a referent object by a securitizing actor, who thereby generates endorsement of emergency measures beyond rules that would otherwise bind. So basically, this is an act of securitization, which is mostly conducted by politicians, by those holding office, holding power, or maybe experts people like community leaders or people writing in the media, journalists, etc. So these people who have a chance to address the nation, to address the society at large, they may engage in the securitizing act. And what we mean by securitizing act is that some issues are constructed as existential threats. So these are basically taken out of the realm of normal politics, and they are securitized, meaning that emergency measures can be adopted. So we are saying, okay, this is a security issue, so we should treat it as a priority, and we should approach this issue, and we should tackle this issue outside of the realm of normal politics. So just as, for example, Viktor Orban has done in relation to the coronavirus, he said this is a security issue, a number one security issue. So he securitized the pandemic, let's say, and then he associated it with an emergency action, and he said that I need emergency powers. I need more power at my hands as the prime minister of this country to tackle this issue. So he securitized this issue and taken it outside the realm of normal politics, and he said that emergency measures are needed to tackle this number one security issue. So of course it is not just coming out of thin air. Of course, it's a major issue. Of course, it's a very stark problem for humanity at large, for all countries, because of the number of infections, etc. But it has been also the reason, let's say, why Viktor Orban engaged in such emergency action. Copenhagen School, of course, here when we are approaching theories, when we are approaching some conceptual analysis of phenomena in the system, in the international relations, social sciences realm, then of course we are also talking about a normative approach as well. So we cannot, in the social sciences realm, we cannot really talk about positivism. I mean, we cannot talk about facts, realities that are true for everyone and always. We cannot talk about them. They are mostly relative. They may be circumstantial. They may be dependent on circumstances, conjuncture, etc. So here again, in the Copenhagen School, we may also talk about a normative approach. Not only how we describe the world, but also how we want to see the world. What are our norms? What are our ethical approaches to the world, to the interaction between states, etc. This has to do with how we also theorize about international relations. So here the Copenhagen School also says that states can be the source of threats rather than of protection for the people. So this is again a novel approach when we especially compare it with realist and neo-realist accounts of security and states. So here it is assumed, in the realist approach, it is assumed that states are there to protect their people against other states and against threats in the international system. But here they are saying that states can be also the source of threats rather than of protection for the people. So especially if we are talking about dictatorships, if we are talking about authoritarian regimes, even in democratic societies, we can see that sometimes states can take measures against the individual that limit the individual's security, and that can put some checks on the freedoms and rights of individuals. So states can also be the source of threats. These may go all the way to, for example, what China is, let's say, today implementing, especially against the Uyghur population, the Uyghur Muslim population there. So here we see that just because of your ethnicity or your religious conviction, you may be purged, you may be repressed by your own state. So here you cannot count on your state to protect your rights and liberties, but you have to protect yourself against the iron hand of the state. Here in authoritarian regimes, this may also take place. In terms of freedom of expression, in many states, again, in the world today, just for writing something on Twitter, sharing an opinion on Twitter, you may be sent to court, you may be sentenced, etc. So states cannot be always source of security for people. So this is understandable enough. However, the Copenhagen School also has maybe sort of a solution to this problem. And they say that strong states, so efficient states, states that can deliver services, that can deliver protection to their people, coexisting in mature anarchy with democratization and development of international human rights law, can be relied on to secure individuals. So here, the Copenhagen School also gives us a perspective. They say that under these such and such conditions, we can also have a world where states can actually be relied upon to secure and to protect their individuals' rights and liberties. So what are the conditions? We should have strong states, so states that are able to deliver. For example, we see that in Mexico, for example, there are drug cartels where they cannot really protect. I mean, we have a lot of people being killed by these drug cartels, and the state cannot protect the security of their own people. So strong security, a strong state that can also cater for the security of their citizens, coexisting in mature anarchy, meaning in the realist paradigm we talked about an anarchic world order where there is no higher authority. So here the Copenhagen School talks about a system of mature anarchy, meaning that it is not a system of uncontrolled anarchy, but it is mature because there is democratization. Most of the states are democratic, so this means that they can talk to each other, and their recourse to violence, their recourse to war is much less than we would have in a system where we would have authoritarian countries, dictatorships, etc., and development of international human rights law. So this would mean that there would be maybe some sanctions against states that violate human rights. So here we wouldn't have just, let's say, the state is totally in control of their citizens, and no matter what they do, then there is no authority higher than the state that may actually put sanctions on the state. Just opposite that, we would have a system where we will have international law, where we will have international human rights law, and where we would have democratic states that would respect these international norms and standards. And under such circumstances, we can rely on the state to secure their individuals. So, of course, these conditions are not met, are not really fulfilled in today's world. But the Copenhagen School, let's say, gives us a perspective of what kind of a world order we should have. And if we have these conditions, if we have these conditions fulfilled, then we can have states protecting the security of their own people. Deepening of security, we have talked, especially after the ending of the Cold War, we talked about a widening and deepening of the concepts of security. Here, when we talk about a deepening of security, we have especially two schools of thought that are mostly approaching the concept of security, mostly in terms of a deepening perspective. So here we have especially pluralists and social constructivists engaging in an analysis of security. Here we are talking about concept of human security, security as a human condition, and also security as a social construct. So here, the security of the system is mostly based on a social construction process, and security, as we talked about, is not only limited to the security of the state, but it is a basic human condition. Whether we feel secure sitting here today, for example, whether you feel secure sitting faced with your computers or faced with your smartphones, whether you feel secure. So even though maybe today in today's world we have such technology, we have some comforts which maybe 2 centuries ago most people wouldn't have even dreamed of. but still a very small, something which we cannot see actually. A virus can cause a security threat to us. So how we approach security can be much more and much deeper than just state security or military security. And here they say that the chief referent object of security should not be the state or certain sub-state groups, but the individual people. So individuals and society, the people living in states, are the major chief referent objects of security in this understanding, especially in the studies of security conducted by pluralists and social constructivists. Folk, writing in 1995, talks about security as the negation of insecurity as it is specifically experienced by individuals and groups in concrete situations. So, individuals and groups, we are talking about individual human beings and also groups such as maybe ethnic groups or political groups, religious groups, social groups, and we should look at how individuals or groups experience security, and it is basically can be defined as the negation of security, the lack of insecurity as security. Again, deepening of security, as we said, is against state-centrism in security studies, against defining security purely in terms of state bodies whose aim is to have secured their state. Who, writing in 2004, he said, if people, be they government ministers or private individuals, perceive an issue to threaten their lives in some way and respond politically to this, then that issue should be deemed a security issue. So again, he talks about how he differentiates between other issues and security issues, and he says that so it is people at large. So they don't have to be politicians, they don't have to be ministers, they can be private individuals, they can be just anybody on the street. And if people perceive an issue to threaten their lives in some way and respond politically to this, then that issue should be deemed a security issue. So, of course, if you are someone holding office, political office, then of course what you see as a security issue may be more important because you have devices, you have power in order to react against this issue and to define an issue as a security issue. But if you are a private citizen which do not really have major power resources at hand, then it may be more difficult for you to translate what you see as a security threat to political action. But you can say, okay, I will vote for such and such party, I will express my opinions on that issue. I'd see this as a major threat. So, for example, let's say we are living in the age of the coronavirus. You think that your government is not taking enough action, enough, let's say, measures against the spread of the coronavirus. So you say, okay, I want more action. I want the government more active in the fight against the spread of this coronavirus or COVID-19, whatever you call it. So, for example, some people in Germany, let's say, may see the increase in migration as a security threat. So they say, okay, I will vote for this party. I will vote for the Alternative for Deutschland party because they represent me the best, and they are of the same opinion with me. They think that migration is the number one security threat for this country. So this can create how we see and how we articulate our idea about security, what we see as major security threats, and it may also become part of the political realm, translated into political action. And then I looked at Eurobarometer surveys. These are surveys conducted within the European Union, and basically it's a public opinion survey which is conducted regularly in the European Union to basically measure what the public thinks, what it thinks about the EU, what it thinks about its own country, whether or not that the persons involved in these public opinion surveys, they trust the EU, they trust EU institutions, etc. So it's a public opinion survey, and very different, various questions are asked around the European Union member states, and the same surveys are also conducted in candidate countries such as Turkey. Also, you can find them online, and you can have a lot of information, a lot of data in the Eurobarometer survey. So I looked especially at the concerns of individuals in the EU. In the text I also sent you in the chapter about security, there were also some results about what the EU people thought about their concerns, their major concerns, what they were worried about, what they feared, especially in their daily lives. And then I checked the latest available data in Eurobarometer, which is from 2019. And here they asked the individuals, what are your primary concerns? What is a security concern for you? And 38% said immigration. This was followed by 29% saying terrorism, that they see terrorism as a major security concern. Then for 18% it's the economic situation. Then for 17% it's the public finances. For 17% it's unemployment. For 11% is EU's influence in the world, the lack of EU's influence in the world. For 11% is climate change, environment, and the change in the climate and all its resulting effects. For 10% is increasing crime. For 9% is cost of living, increasing cost of living. For 8% is again degradation of the environment, problems in environmental pollution. For 4% is energy supply, so problems whether it's expensive, whether it's hard to find the sources of energy. For 4% is pensions, especially maybe the future of the pension system, social security, and 4% is taxation. So this is, of course, people can choose not only one option but a number of options. So this gives us the most preferred options by individuals. So immigration seen as number one, then followed by terrorism, followed by worsening deterioration of the economic situation, followed by public finances, increasing unemployment, and waning influence in the world, climate change, etc. So these basically, then we can ask ourselves, what do we do with these data? I mean, we now know a bit about what people throughout the EU think about their environment, think about the society, and what they see as major security threats, major security concerns. So under such conditions, these concerns by individuals should also translate into policy, should also translate into the politics of the states they live in and politics of the European Union. So they would expect the EU and their own states to engage in maybe viable immigration policies. So they wouldn't want uncontrolled migration. They would also maybe wish for effective integration of immigrants, and they would want to see a viable immigration policy. They would want to see fight against terrorism. When they are faced with an act of terrorism, then they would be frightened and they would look to the state to engage in viable action against terrorism. Again, economic situation can be, so this is a non-military situation, of course, economic situation or immigration, different from terrorism, because terrorism can be tackled by military means, but also you would need non-military policies to tackle terrorism because of the homegrown terrorism that is a major issue in the European Union, that especially people born in the EU can also engage in acts of terrorism. Economic situation, public finances, unemployment, all these are related with the economic situation. So when you have low growth, when you have inflation, major problems in the economic situation, then this creates problems. So in today's Italy, for example, we know that Italy is the number one country where you have the largest number of deaths from the coronavirus or COVID-19 virus, the pandemic. And maybe part of the explanation why you have such a high number of deaths in Italy and not, for example, in Germany, could be also explained with the economic problems that Italy has been going through since a quite considerable time now. So these can be all related to the quality of life, social life, the political system, viability of policies of the government. Now we will take a look at the European Union's understanding of security. Uh, as we talked about before, the European communities, when they were first established in the 1950s, were mostly concerned with the establishment of a single market. As we talked about, there was a sort of an experiment with the European defense community, the European political community. However, it was never ratified and it was rejected by the French Parliament, so it was never actually implemented. However, in the 1970s, we again began to see the development of a political identity within the European community. We had the start of European political cooperation, which was outside the remit of the formal integration process. It was mostly a voluntary cooperation among the member states of the European community. Later, after the ending of the Cold War, again we see that the issue of foreign and security policy gained in importance. We have seen that the European political cooperation entering into the formal treaties of the European Community, first with the Single European Act of 1986, and then with the Maastricht Treaty, we see the common foreign and security policy included into the treaties. Of course, when we talk about a common foreign and security policy, this is more an objective rather than an accomplished aim. And we see some mechanisms, institutions being put into place in order to establish the basis of a common foreign and security policy for the European Union. And in the 2000s, the EU also established strategies which would determine the EU action in the realm of security and foreign policy and defense policy. So now we will look at these security strategies which were prepared by the European Union. The EU security strategy of 2003 was titled as A Secure Europe in a Better World. And here, if you remember the world of 2003, then we were talking about a European Union that was just on the verge of its largest enlargement in the history. As we talked about, the EU enlarged in 1973, and then in 1981, 1986, and then in 1995. And afterwards, the largest enlargement was in 2004, and the Treaty of Athens was the treaty of, let's say, the enlargement process, the accession of these new countries into the European Union. And in 2004, this entered into force, and we had the 10 countries becoming members of the EU. These were both Central and Eastern European countries, and also we had Malta and Greek Cypriots also as representing the Republic of Cyprus entering into the European Union. So the EU was actually quite jubilant at that time because an integration, a gradual process of integrating these countries into the European Union was succeeded. In 2004, we had these countries entering into the EU, and then in 2007, we had Bulgaria and Romania also becoming members of the European Union. So the EU had not, this time in 2003, had not yet experienced the problems of this largest enlargement. It didn't have the problem of Hungary or Poland acting in contravention of some of the EU values, or problems in Romania and Bulgaria which were experienced after they became members of the EU. So at that time, the idea was that membership to the EU would actually solve all these problems. So these countries would first fulfill the Copenhagen criteria for membership to the EU, and afterwards everything would be perfect. There would be no, let's say, backlashes, no problems in the fulfillment of the Copenhagen criteria after membership. So membership would be a panacea for everything. However, as things would turn out later on, these would not be really true. And we would have also an EU in 2003, which didn't experience the financial crisis of 2008, 2010, the problems especially which were experienced in the south of the EU, especially in Greece, in Italy, the problems in especially adhering to the Maastricht criteria, which were the criteria of the euro area. This was an EU, again, which didn't really experience the refugee crisis of the recent period, especially 2015, 2016. So it was a more optimistic, we can say, European Union, a EU which looked more optimistically to the world, which looked at itself, viewed itself more confidently. So here we see this psychology, let's say, reflected also in the EU security strategy of 2003. So when we look at the wording of this security strategy, it says, Europe has never been so prosperous, so secure, nor so free. So it is talking about three important concepts: security, prosperity, and freedom. And it says that Europe has achieved these. The EU is the architect of these three important values, let's say, that the Europe has at the moment. The violence of the first half of the 20th century has given way to a period of peace and stability unprecedented in European history. So this is again an achievement of the European Union. The EU was established on the basis of two world wars, devastation of Europe, especially after the Second World War, unspeakable atrocities, Holocaust, all these memories of the violence of the first half of the 20th century. But through the establishment of the European communities, now we have been able to create a period of peace and stability unprecedented in European history. And the strategy says that the creation of the European Union has been central to this development. It has transformed the relations between our states and the lives of our citizens. So the European Union was able to transform interstate relations in Europe. A regional integration or process in the European Union was responsible for the transformation of relations between states from relations based on conflict, confrontation, to relations based on dialogue, peace, and integration. And also not only the relations between states, but also the lives of citizens have been transformed. European countries are committed to dealing peacefully with disputes and to cooperating through common institutions. Over this period, the progressive spread of the rule of law and democracy has seen authoritarian regimes change into secure, stable, and dynamic democracies. So here again, one of the most important successes, one of the most important achievements of the European Union was the spread of rule of law and democracy and the transformation of authoritarian regimes into secure, stable, and dynamic democracies. This was achieved in Europe itself, with especially the democratization of the Federal Republic of Germany at the end of the Second World War. In the West of Germany, we have seen the establishment of a democratic constitution, a pluralist system, the establishment of rule of law. In Italy, again, we have seen the same thing, which was living under a fascist regime until 1943, if I remember correctly. And also we have seen authoritarian regimes turning into democracies in Southern Europe, in Spain, after the Franco changing to a democratic regime. We have seen it in the case of Portugal. We have seen it in the case of Greece after the fall of the military junta. and this can be seen as an achievement of European integration. And also, with the ending of the Cold War, the liberalization of Central and Eastern Europe, the turning of to democracy in countries such as Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and the other countries of Eastern Europe. And the enlargement process, especially the largest enlargement, which would take place in 2004, was seen as responsible of making a reality of the vision of a united and peaceful continent. And the strategy is also paying tribute to the United States, saying that the United States of America has also played a critical role in European integration and European security, in particular through NATO. So if it weren't for NATO, maybe it would be more difficult for the EU, actually, the EU project to succeed, because NATO provided a security shield, and the United States was responsible for the continuation of NATO during the Cold War, especially with its nuclear force and nuclear deterrence against the Soviet Union. As of course, we talked about some of the problems in NATO during the Cold War, that the European countries did not feel themselves secure, and they thought that the United States was acting unilaterally, and maybe in a security situation, in a security threat, they wouldn't be able to count on the United States. But overall, when they look back to the Cold War era, they see that NATO was there, and NATO provided a security shield for Western Europe. So they pay tribute to the United States for that, for the support it has shown to European integration. And the end of the Cold War has left the United States in a dominant position as a military actor. However, no single country is able to tackle today's complex problems on its own. So it also maybe calls upon the United States. The strategy says that acting all by itself or acting unilaterally cannot be the solution. Okay, at that time, maybe we can talk about, especially just after the ending of the Cold War, after the demise of the Soviet Union, we can say that the United States was the unipolar actor. So it was the unipolar moment for the United States. However, this cannot mean that the United States will solve the world's all issues on its own, or it will act just on the basis of its own interests. And the EU is calling on the world, and also all the dominant actor, the United States. It says that no single country is able to tackle today's complex problems on its own. So act in unison with other countries. Act together with your partners, allies. Act in multilateral fora. Vitalize international organizations. Vitalize the spirit of international cooperation. Of course, this was not really taken very seriously, as we see the later events have shown us that the US tended to act unilaterally rather than in unison with other countries. And then the strategy, the paper, the EU security strategy paper goes on to identify what the EU sees as key threats to the security of this precious actor. So the EU is triumphant in the eyes of the EU institutions, the writers of this security strategy. It was able to achieve prosperity, security, and freedom in Europe. But now we have to protect what we have achieved, because there are multiple threats threatening our prosperity, security, and freedom. And what are these threats? In the first instance, the security strategy talks about terrorism as a key threat, because terrorism is existential. It directly threatens not only our income, economic situation, social situation, but it basically threatens our lives. It can kill us. Terrorism can kill us in a very bad way. So terrorism puts lives at risk. It imposes large costs. It seeks to undermine the openness and tolerance of our societies, and it poses a growing strategic threat to the whole of Europe. So it puts our lives at risk, and also it has larger costs For example, it can undermine the openness and tolerance of our societies. So people will be threatened of each other, and the states may impose much stricter security policies in order to fight against terrorism. So it may, just like the Patriot Act, for example, which was imposed by the United States after the 9/11 attacks, we can see that especially individual freedoms, right to privacy, right to information, freedom of expression, all these things can be under threat by a state that is more interventionist, but by a state that is more authoritarian because of its fight against terrorism. So it may be also a threat to the openness and tolerance of our societies, and it may pose a growing strategic threat to the whole of Europe, to the whole of the stability of Europe. And then the security strategy goes on to talk about the terrorist movements of today. It says that increasingly terrorist movements are well resourced, connected by electronic networks, and are willing to use unlimited violence to cause massive casualties. So now they have resources, they have financial resources, they may make use of electronic networks, they may make use of internet, for example, just as we have seen in the case of ISIS. They have made use of social media in order to engage in propaganda, in order to also recruit people, let's say, fighters for their cause, and they are not really they are willing to use unlimited violence. The most recent wave of terrorism is global in scope and is linked to violent religious extremism. So they are talking especially at that time about Al-Qaeda, which was also responsible for the 9/11 attacks against the United States. So violent religious extremism can be a destabilizing factor also in Europe. And the links of these terrorist organizations, and especially young people, can engage in their and they can become followers of these terrorist organizations. It arises out of complex causes. These include the pressures of modernization, cultural, social, and political crises, and the alienation of young people living in foreign societies. This phenomenon is also a part of our own society. So here the strategy talks about the social origins of the rise of terrorism, the social causes, why, for example, young people can be drawn to violent religious extremism. For example, why someone living in a developed country in Western Europe can basically engage with ISIS and can travel to Syria, for example, to fight for ISIS. So these are of course, very complex questions. The motivations of these people should be also studied. For example, why do they seek to join these violent religious extremism? And also, what can be done to prevent these people from supporting these terrorist groups, or from acting and supporting these terrorist groups? So terrorism, the fight against terrorism, and how we can eliminate terrorism in Europe and the rest of the world, maybe, because they are connected. It's global in nature. Second threat that the strategy paper talks about is the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. So this is again seen as potentially the greatest threat to the security of Europe. Here again, of course, there are some international arrangements, treaties, control of the export of weapons of mass destruction, and control over, let's say, preventing the spread of weapons of mass destruction. So there are all these maybe mechanisms, international mechanisms. However, the security strategy is talking about some security threats associated with proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. So it is saying that we are now entering a new and dangerous period that raises the possibility of a weapons of mass destruction arms race, especially in the Middle East. So especially with growing destabilization of the Middle East, the regime changes, and both the interstate and the intrastate conflict in the Middle East, we can see that there can be an arms race about this problem of the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Then the security strategy talks about advances in biological sciences and especially the threat of the use of biological weapons. So this can be a threat. Attacks with chemical and radiological materials can also be seen as a serious possibility. The spread of missile technology adds a further element of instability and could put Europe at increasing risk. So, weapons of mass destruction, the use of chemical weapons, biological weapons, these can be all seen as security threats. These are, of course, mostly in the realm of military threats to security, and they can also influence the security of Europe, not only Middle East, but also linked with the security of Europe. And here we have seen in the case of Iraq, for example, in Halepce, Saddam used these weapons against the Kurdish population living there. And then we have seen, especially in the Syrian case, the Assad regime again used these against civilians. We have seen some, let's say, reports about the use of chemical agents against civilian population. So this can be also a major threat to security, and this should be tackled. The uses of weapons of mass destruction should be tackled. Then, thirdly, the security strategy talks about regional conflicts, those regional conflicts that cannot be contained, that cannot be resolved, and that can spread throughout regions. So the security strategy talks about problems such as those in Kashmir, the Great Lakes region in Africa, and the Korean Peninsula impact on European interests directly and indirectly, as the conflicts nearer to home, above all in the Middle East. Violent or frozen conflicts, which also persist on our borders, threaten regional stability. They destroy human lives and social and physical infrastructure. They threaten minorities, fundamental freedoms, and human rights. Conflict can lead to extremism, terrorism, and state failure. It provides opportunities for organized crime. Regional insecurity can fuel the demand for weapons of mass destruction. The most practical way to tackle the often elusive new threats will sometimes be to deal with the older problems of regional conflict. So here, the security strategy is talking about the interconnected nature of security threats. So we may talk about some frozen problems, frozen conflicts which cannot be resolved, and how they may lead to further security risks. So, first of all, they are, of course, threats to the viability of these regions. They may destroy human lives and social and physical infrastructures. Then they threaten minorities living there. They may threaten the regime there. They may threaten human rights, fundamental freedoms, because they may also limit the life choices of the people living there. They may be also linked with terrorism, extremism, organized crime. So, because of the problems in the governance of these areas, for example, organized crime or terrorist networks may find that they can survive in those regions. For example, let's say in the north of Iraq, we have seen the PKK taking refuge there, and then in the 1990s, we have seen that the leader of the PKK was living in Syria, for example. So all these can be related. It may provide opportunities for organized crime, and also regional insecurity may create an arms race for the states living in that region. So they may increasingly resort to weapons of mass destruction, which may create again a very insecure environment for the region, and they may also be linked with the spread of these insecurity and problems related with security. Another important security threat that the security strategies talk about is state failure. So this is basically when a state is no longer able to function, when a state is no longer able to fend for the security, viability, welfare of its citizens. So when we have the failure of state functions, then it creates an environment which is susceptible to terrorism, organized crime, and threats against human security. So all kinds of, again, threats to international security may also emanate from such failed states. So it creates bad governance, corruption, abuse of power, weak institutions, lack of accountability, and civil conflict corroding states from within. In some cases, this has brought about the collapse of state institutions. Somalia, Liberia, and Afghanistan under the Taliban are the best known recent examples. Collapse of the state can be associated with obvious threats such as organized crime or terrorism. State failure is an alarming phenomenon that undermines global governance as to regional instability. So this is seen as, again, a major security threat. Not only the failure of the state, such as we have seen in the case of Afghanistan, for example, where we see the emergence of rival power holders such as the Taliban, terrorist networks, Al Qaeda being also headquartered in Afghanistan. Of course, we cannot just see it as a local problem because we know that the Taliban was also supported by the United States against the Soviet Union, especially. So this is, of course, linked. They can never be seen as only local problems, only problems related with that country alone, because other actors, especially global actors, are mostly involved in such problems. Again, we see the issue of resilience of states, state governance, especially and the state being resilient against such threats is also quite important. Organized crime is also seen as a major security threat by the European Union in its security strategy of 2003. And the security strategy says that Europe is a prime target for organized crime. This internal threat to our security has an important external dimension. Cross border trafficking in drugs, women, illegal migrants, and weapons accounts for a large part of the activities of criminal gangs. It can have links with terrorism. So these crime networks that may emanate from the both inside the EU and from the larger neighborhood of Europe, from Caucasia, from the Balkans. They can engage in networks of organized crime, and these are mostly internal security threats. They can again threaten the viability of the state, threaten the security of the individuals, and it necessitates a strategy of fighting against organized crime. So this is, for example, drug trafficking. Drug is a security threat because especially young people may become addicted to these drugs. Women, again, may be trafficked for prostitution, for other types of activity. This is, again, a threat. Illegal migration, again, people can be just put into trucks or put into boats and taken by these organized crime networks to Europe. Weapons, again, play an important role. So all these are seen as internal and external security threats for the European Union. Then the security threat talks about addressing the threats, how we can tackle these threats, and how we can prevent these new threats. So the strategy talks about the globalization as an important factor, and it says that in this era of globalization, we cannot say that some threats are distant from us, so we are not concerned with them, they are not our problem. So this strategy says that distant threats may be as much a concern as those that are near at hand. Nuclear activities in North Korea, nuclear risks in South Asia, and proliferation in the Middle East are all concerned to Europe. So even something that happens in North Korea, which is far away geographically to Europe, can be seen as a security threat. Terrorists and criminals are now able to operate worldwide. Their activities in Central or Southeast Asia may be a threat to European countries or their citizens. Meanwhile, global communication increases awareness in Europe of regional conflicts or humanitarian tragedies anywhere in the world. So, we are living in a global village. So, nowhere is actually distant. None of these security threats are distant. So, we should all address these threats. They are our concerns, and we should try to tackle these security threats. How can we prevent these new threats? So here again, the security strategy talks about the traditional concept of self-defense during the Cold War, which was based on the threat of invasion. So it basically says that in the Cold War years, our primary security threat was the possibility of an invasion from outside, territorial invasion by the Soviet Union or its satellites in Eastern Europe. However, with the new threats, we are no longer talking about the threat of invasion, but our first line of defense against these new security threats should be abroad. The threats are dynamic. The risks of proliferation grow over time. Left alone, terrorist networks will become ever more dangerous. State failure and organized crime spread if they are neglected, as we have seen in West Africa. This implies that we should be ready to act before a crisis occurs. Conflict prevention and threat prevention cannot start too early. So here we have a more proactive sort of defense policy. So we will not wait for the security threat to come to Europe and to threaten us directly. We will not threaten for terrorists, for example. We will not wait for terrorists to come to Europe to engage in an act there, but we will try to prevent the emergence of the security threat. So we should act abroad. We should engage with other countries in order to prevent these security threats from actually becoming real threats or real security concerns, and we should prevent them before a crisis occurs. So we also see that the security strategy focuses on conflict prevention and threat prevention, and these should be strategies. The EU should have resources, it should have institutions, it should have capabilities in order to deal with these new threats and to prevent these threats from engaging in real action, real cases, real events threatening the security of Europe. The document talks about a mixture of instruments, and it says that in contrast to the massive visible threat in the Cold War, none of the new threats is purely military, nor can any be tackled by purely military means. And here we see that the EU's approach to security has also deepened, as we have talked about the deepening and widening of security in the post-Cold War era. So it says that to deal with these military and non-military threats to security, we require a mixture of instruments. So here, for example, proliferation may be contained through export controls and attacked through political, economic, and other pressures, while the underlying political causes are also tackled. Dealing with terrorism may require a mixture of intelligence, police, judicial, military, and other means. In failed states, military instruments may be needed to restore order, humanitarian means to tackle the immediate crisis. Regional conflicts need political solutions, but military assets and effective policing may be needed in the post-conflict phase. So we need both military and non-military measures in order to deal and tackle with these new security threats. And here we are given a number of examples. For example, in order to deal with weapons of mass destruction, for example, we need export controls, we need political, economic measures, we need to deal with terrorism, we require a mixture of intelligence, police, judicial, military, and other means. So it all requires not only military measures, not only things that we can do by using an army, but we need social measures, we need integration policies, we need policing, we need intelligence, we need diplomacy, we need political cooperation, etc. So it is a very integrated, it should be a very sophisticated security policy. The security strategy also talks about security in the neighborhood, meaning in the vicinity of the European Union, in those countries that have borders with the European Union. So it says that even in an era of globalization, geography is still important. It is in the European interest that countries on our borders are well governed. So the EU needs that countries that have borders with the EU are also functioning properly, well governed states. Neighbors who are engaged in violent conflict, weak states where organized crime flourishes, dysfunctional societies, or exploding population growth on its borders all pose problems for Europe. The integration of acceding states increases our security but also brings the EU closer to troubled areas. Our task is to promote a ring of well-governed countries to the east of the European Union and on the borders of the Mediterranean with whom we can enjoy close and cooperative relations.